They said Pontiac was finished. By the mid-1950s, the once proud division of General Motors had become a shadow of itself, a brand your dad might drive, your granddad might polish, but nobody under 40 wanted to be seen in. In an era where cars were extensions of identity, Pontiac's identity had gone missing. Its cars were slow, heavy, and painfully plain, the kind of vehicles that blended into traffic and disappeared. Inside GM headquarters, whispers grew louder. Maybe it was time to cut Pontiac loose. After all, who needed another middle-of-the-road brand when Chevrolet was dominating the affordable market and Buick was soaking up the luxury crowd? Pontiac had no place left to go. But fate has a strange way of rewriting stories. Because what was about to happen in 1959 would not only save Pontiac, it would ignite a movement. One so bold that even GM's own executives didn't see it coming. This is the story of the car that outclassed General Motors itself, the 1959 Pontiac Bonneville. And to understand why this single car mattered so much, you have to step back into Detroit, 1956. The city was booming. The smell of steel, gasoline, and ambition filled the air. Chrome was king. Designers were sculpting cars like jet fighters, and every automaker was locked in a style war. But inside Pontiac's design rooms, the atmosphere was dead. Engineers were playing it safe. Designers were told to stay conservative. Every car looked like it was built for the country club, not the open road. Pontiac's customers were aging, and so was its image. Then, a 43-year-old firebrand named Salmon Bunky Knudsen walked in, the youngest general manager Pontiac had ever seen. And from the moment he stepped into that dull conference room at GM, everything changed. Knudsen didn't believe in safe. He believed in standing out. He looked at Pontiac's design sketches, boxy sedans, polite grills, flat fenders, and said something that would echo across Detroit. "We're not building cars for old men anymore." To most of GM's executives, it sounded reckless. To Knudsen, it was survival. He saw a dying brand and knew only a complete transformation could save it. He didn't just want Pontiac to improve. He wanted it to become something else entirely, something fast, something proud, something unmistakably American. So, he called in two of the sharpest minds he could find, a young engineer named John DeLorean and a designer named Pete Estes. Together, they formed the trio that would drag Pontiac from the edge of extinction into the golden age of American performance. Their philosophy was simple. Make it wider. Make it faster. Make it beautiful. They tore through GM's bureaucratic red tape. When corporate rules said, use Chevrolet parts, they built their own. When finance teams said, stay conservative, they doubled down on risk. Pontiac's transformation would start with one bold idea, a completely new stance. Knudsen believed cars should look powerful before they even started. So he widened Pontiac's wheel track, the distance between the left and right tires, by several inches. It gave the car a lower, more planted stance that changed everything about how it looked and drove. When you saw it coming, you didn't think, family sedan. You thought, muscle. That visual change would become the birth of a legend, wide-track Pontiac. But before the world would see that transformation, the team had to build a car that could carry this new identity, something luxurious, confident, and dripping with personality. That car would be called the 1959 Pontiac Bonneville. It wasn't the first Bonneville. The name had appeared before. But this version was different. This was the car that carried an entire division's future on its shoulders. When it debuted, it didn't just turn heads. It stopped traffic. The first thing you noticed was its stance, wide, low, and confident. From the front, the split grille looked like a grin, framed by quad headlights and a gold anodized mesh that sparkled under sunlight. At the center, Pontiac's silver arrowhead emblem pointed forward, like a spear daring the future to get out of the way. And the proportions, they were perfect. The long hood stretched ahead like a runway. The bubble-top roof looked as if it were floating on glass. Chrome traced every curve, but it wasn't gaudy. It was balanced, sculpted, alive. Knudsen and his team had done something remarkable. They had turned geometry into emotion. From the side, the Bonneville's lines flowed seamlessly, a sculpted ribbon of steel running from nose to tail. A bold chrome strip swept across the body, wrapping around the rear fender in a dramatic boomerang shape. The car looked fast even when it was parked, and then came the rear view, pure theater. Twin tail fins rose sharply like jet wings, with dual taillights glowing red beneath the wide Pontiac script. Every curve, every fin, every shadow had purpose. It wasn't just designed, it was staged. This wasn't another GM sedan. This was a rebellion in chrome. Step inside, and you'd feel it instantly. The dashboard stretched across the cabin like a cockpit. Chrome gleamed from every angle, offset by rich vinyls and leather grains. Deep-set circular gauges sat like aircraft instruments, glowing softly behind the wheel. And at the center, the Pontiac arrowhead shined on a two-spoke steering wheel, a symbol of the brand's rebirth. Every inch was coordinated, colors, trims, textures. Whether you chose turquoise, red, gold, or cream, the Bonneville felt personal. Every handle, knob, and stitch was sculpted with pride. This wasn't luxury that whispered, it spoke loud and confident, just like the car's new identity. But beauty wasn't enough. Pontiac's transformation couldn't survive on looks alone. So under that sweeping hood sat the heart of the revolution, a 389 cubic inch V8. It roared to life with anywhere from 260 to over 300 horsepower, depending on how brave you were with the options sheet. And if you really wanted to make a statement, you checked one box that changed everything. Tri-power. 3 two-barrel carburetors. When you pressed the throttle, the first carb handled cruising. But push harder. The outer two snapped open, dumping fuel and air straight into the heart of that engine. The sound? A deep mechanical growl that didn't just announce speed, it declared dominance. For the first time, Pontiac didn't just look powerful, it was powerful. On the road, the difference was night and day. That wide-track stance wasn't just marketing, it was magic. The car cornered flatter, felt planted, and inspired confidence in a way few full-size American cars ever had. Motor Trend wrote that the Bonneville handled like a car half its size, and for a machine that weighed nearly 2 tons, that was nothing short of a miracle. By 1959, Pontiac wasn't just alive again, it was unstoppable. Sales soared, dealerships couldn't keep up. The Bonneville wasn't a car anymore, it was a movement. And yet, behind all the applause, a quiet tension was building inside General Motors. Because Pontiac-ass success had exposed something uncomfortable, a truth GM-ass executives weren't ready to face. Pontiac wasn't just competing with Ford or Chrysler anymore. It was competing with GM's own hierarchy. The Bonneville had outshined Chevrolet in style, outperformed Buick in excitement, and even threatened Cadillac's luxury image. For the first time in decades, the middle child of General Motors had stolen the spotlight. And up in the glass offices of Detroit's GM Tower, some people didn't like that. Rumors began to swirl that Pontiac was growing too fast, that Knudsen's team was pushing too hard. But the truth, GM didn't expect one of its divisions to outclass the company itself. Pontiac had become a symbol of rebellion within the empire, and the 1959 Bonneville was its flag. The world didn't know it yet, but this moment, this car, would start a chain reaction that would redefine American performance for an entire decade. Because in just a few years, the same minds behind the Bonneville would unleash something even more dangerous, something that would break the rules of corporate restraint and birth a new kind of legend. But before that revolution began, the Bonneville had to prove one thing, that emotion and engineering could coexist, that a car could be both elegant and defiant. And as the sun set on Detroit's skyline in 1959, one thing was certain: Pontiac had awakened. Pontiac had done the impossible. A brand that was on life support just a few years earlier was now breathing new life into Detroit itself. Showrooms were packed again. Crowds surrounded the 1959 Bonneville as if it were a celebrity. But success didn't come quietly. Inside General Motors, Pontiac's sudden rise caused a ripple of unease, because if Pontiac could outshine its siblings, what did that say about the company's carefully built hierarchy? For decades, GM had ruled America's roads through a clear ladder of luxury. You started with a Chevrolet, maybe worked your way up to an Oldsmobile, then a Buick, and if you really made it, a Cadillac. That was the natural order. But Pontiac's resurgence had broken that chain. People were walking past Buicks to buy Bonnevilles. They were trading Cadillacs for something faster, younger, more exciting. And to some inside GM's glass tower, that was dangerous. But Knudsen didn't care. He wasn't trying to protect GM's pecking order. He was building something bigger, a culture. He wanted drivers to feel something when they saw a Pontiac. Not respect, not prestige, emotion. That idea, selling emotion instead of hierarchy, became Pontiac's secret weapon. Knudsen and his young lieutenant, John DeLorean, knew they had a powerful car. But they also knew that a great car could die without the right story. So they turned to advertising. Not the safe, polished ads that Cadillac used. No, they wanted something raw. Something that would make you want a Pontiac before you even saw one in person. The result was a campaign that would become one of the most iconic in American automotive history. Wide Track America. The slogan was simple. The message was revolutionary. Pontiac didn't sell its cars as machines. It sold them as freedom. Bold, youthful, confident freedom. The ads showed Bonnevilles and Catalinas slicing through open highways, their wide stances gripping the road, chrome gleaming under sunlight. The voiceovers didn't talk about features or pricing. They spoke to identity. You weren't buying a car. You were buying the feeling of taking control. For a country at the peak of post-war optimism, that message hit home. America was expanding. Suburbs, highways, ambition. And Pontiac positioned itself as the car for people who refused to blend in. Every photo, every tagline, every inch of ad copy carried a subtle defiance. You can follow the crowd or you can drive a wide track. The brilliance of this campaign wasn't just the marketing. It was how it connected directly to the engineering. Pontiac had actually built something unique with its wider stance. The car really did handle differently, feel planted, and drive with confidence. So when the ad said, "Wide Track America," it wasn't just a slogan. It was truth turned into art. Dealerships couldn't keep up with demand. In just a few short years, Pontiac's sales exploded, climbing from near the bottom of GM's charts to one of its top 3 divisions. The Bonneville became the crown jewel of that success. And if you were lucky enough to see one on the street in 1959 or 1960, you'd understand why. The Bonneville wasn't just an object of admiration. It was a statement. It carried itself differently. It had presence. The sound of the 389 V8 was deep and steady, with that unmistakable mechanical rhythm that only old Detroit iron could produce. When you stood near one idling, you didn't just hear the engine. You felt it in your chest. The low growl through twin exhausts sounded like restrained power, a lion just before it roars. And when the driver dropped the hammer, the car came alive. The tri-power setup opened. The tone changed instantly, smooth growl turning into a full-throated thunder. Tires chirped, chrome gleamed, and the Bonneville surged forward like it was tearing away from the past itself. People had never seen a full-size luxury car behave like that. Pontiac had pulled off something remarkable, combining the elegance of Cadillac, the affordability of Chevrolet, and the performance spirit of a sports car. It wasn't supposed to work, but it did. And suddenly, every other brand looked old. Knudsen and DeLorean didn't stop there. They knew the Bonneville was just the beginning. They wanted the entire Pontiac lineup to carry that same energy. So they poured the wide-track philosophy into everything. The Catalina, the Star Chief, even the Safari station wagon. Yes, a station wagon. It sounds absurd today, but even that family hauler looked athletic and daring compared to its competitors. The Safari had sweeping chrome lines, generous fins, and interiors that looked more like an aircraft lounge than a grocery getter. Pontiac wasn't just selling cars anymore. It was selling a lifestyle, one that said, you can have power and personality. You can have family and freedom. That duality, performance meets polish, was what made the brand unstoppable through the early 1960s. But the magic ingredient was how Pontiac made people feel. Other brands talked about prestige. Pontiac talked about you. The commercials didn't feature tuxedos and chandeliers. They showed young couples driving along Pacific highways, hair blowing, music playing, chrome flashing. It was effortless cool, and everyone wanted in. Magazines couldn't stop talking about it. Motor Trend, Car Life, and Road and Track all praised Pontiac for doing the unthinkable, building a luxury car that made you smile through every curve. The Bonneville had redefined what luxury could mean. No longer was it about isolation or silence. Pontiac's idea of luxury was emotional. You could feel the engine, hear the tires, sense the road. It was alive. And for America, that mattered. Because in the late 1950s and early 60s, the country was changing fast. The space race was on. Rock and roll was exploding. Youth culture was beginning to reshape everything. Music, fashion, even cars. Pontiac had tapped straight into that energy. It wasn't selling to retirees anymore. It was selling to dreamers, adventurers, and young professionals who wanted something that looked as alive as they felt. Every Bonneville, every Catalina, every gleaming wide-track model rolling off the line carried that spark. And just as Pontiac's momentum hit full stride, another legend was waiting in the wings. John DeLorean, the same young engineer who helped Knudsen reinvent the Bonneville, had a new idea brewing. He believed Pontiac could go even further, that they could take the wide-track philosophy and distill it into something smaller, lighter, and faster. It was an idea that would break GM's corporate rules and nearly cost him his career. But it would also give birth to one of the greatest American legends ever built, the Pontiac GTO. But that's a story for another day. For now, the Bonneville remained the king. It was Pontiac's flagship, a car that defined not just the brand, but an era. Collectors often call it the perfect balance of design, power, and personality, a time capsule of everything the late 1950s promised about the American dream. But the Bonneville's story wasn't finished, because while Pontiac was climbing the charts, a quiet storm was forming beneath the surface, one that would test everything the wide-track movement had built and reveal whether Pontiac's newfound soul could survive the changing tides of American culture. Soft, transitional music cue, nostalgic tone fading into a low engine rumble. By the early 1960s, America's love affair with chrome and fins was fading. The jet age look that once symbolized progress now looked flashy, almost old-fashioned. Designers across Detroit started pulling back. Lower fins, cleaner lines, more subtle styling. But Pontiac? They didn't follow trends. They set them. So instead of backing down, Knudsen's team doubled down on proportion and stance. They refined the Bonneville's design, smoother, sharper, but still unmistakably wide. They made sure that even as trends shifted, Pontiac would always look confident. Every year, new colors, new trims, and even bolder interiors arrived. The Bonneville didn't age, it evolved. And every time it did, it reminded America that Pontiac wasn't just another division in GM's portfolio. It was a movement within a corporation, a heartbeat that refused to conform. The result? Loyalty. Pontiac owners didn't just drive their cars, they defended them. They formed clubs, met at shows, and shared stories of road trips, rebuilds, and races. For many, Their Bonneville wasn't just transportation. It was freedom made of metal and memory. And that's the magic that no corporate boardroom could ever understand. Pontiac didn't just sell cars. It sold belonging. From the smell of vinyl seats to the metallic shimmer of that red Pontiac lettering across the trunk, every detail was personal. It reminded people of who they were, or who they wanted to be. And that's why, even decades later, when you see a '59 Bonneville gliding by, that long, low silhouette gleaming in sunlight, it still turns heads. It still commands respect. Because this wasn't just a car that outclassed its rivals. It was the car that taught Detroit how to dream again. By 1959, Pontiac wasn't supposed to be special. It was meant to fill a gap, to be the polite car for middle-aged buyers stuck between Chevrolet S affordability and Oldsmobile S luxury. But somehow, under the fluorescent lights of Detroit's design studios, that plan quietly unraveled. The car that rolled out of those doors wasn't what GM expected. It was faster, louder, and prouder. It was Pontiac, reborn. The 1959 Bonneville wasn't just a car. It was a declaration of war, not against Ford or Chrysler, but against GM's own bureaucracy. The Bonneville didn't ask for permission to exist. It demanded it. It was wide, low, and muscular in a way that none of GM's conservative divisions dared to be. It wasn't shaped by accountants. It was shaped by rebellion. John DeLorean's engineering team had pushed the envelope far beyond the corporate playbook. The new wide-track stance widened the car's front and rear track by 5 inches, a subtle design tweak that changed everything. Suddenly, Pontiac handled differently. It felt stable, grounded. American highways had never seen something like it. You could throw it into corners and it wouldn't flinch. It wasn't just style anymore. It was control. GM executives didn't like surprises. But when early test drives came back with glowing reviews, even the skeptics began to notice something was happening. The press couldn't stop talking about the Bonneville. Motor Trend called it the most distinctive car of 1959. The public response was electric. Dealerships had waiting lists. Pontiac's reputation, once gray and fading, began to shimmer again. But underneath the praise, there was tension. Because Bonneville's success was an embarrassment for GM's upper ranks. The car had broken too many rules to exist. It had used resources Pontiac wasn't supposed to have. It had defied corporate design hierarchy. It was a car built on passion, not policy, and that made the higher-ups nervous. Inside GM's tech center, whispers began to spread. The Bonneville was being called the car that beat GM at its own game. And they weren't wrong. It looked better than a Buick, drove sharper than an Oldsmobile, and had the kind of youthful appeal that Chevrolet could only dream of. For the first time in decades, Pontiac wasn't just a middle child in the GM family. It was the favorite. The success sent shockwaves through the company. Suddenly, Pontiac had a new identity. No longer the car of quiet respectability, it became the car of performance, of pride, of raw American excitement. And it didn't stop there. The wide-track philosophy evolved into an entire marketing movement. Billboards stretched across highways reading "Wider is better." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a statement, a promise that Pontiac would never be boring again. That energy carried into everything Pontiac touched. The Bonneville set the tone for the decade to come. It paved the way for cars like the Catalina, the Grand Prix, and eventually the GTO, the muscle car that would define an era. But without the Bonneville, none of that would have happened. This was the spark that lit the fire. What made it even more remarkable was how close it came to being killed. Months before production, GM accountants tried to scale back the chrome, reduce the engine options, and limit the interior details to save money. But Pontiac's designers fought tooth and nail. They hid projects, resubmitted drawings, and played politics in secret just to keep their car alive. Every inch of chrome on the Bonneville was a battle won. And when it hit the streets, America noticed. The car looked like a missile, Long, sleek, sculpted, the tail fins, instead of mimicking Cadillac's excess, flowed with precision. The split grille would become a Pontiac signature for decades. Under the hood, the 389 V8 roared like a challenge to every other GM division. It wasn't just competing, it was outperforming. That engine became a legend in itself. Tuned versions would later dominate NASCAR and drag strips, carrying Pontiac's name far beyond showrooms. And every time a Pontiac won a race, GM's hierarchy cringed just a little. Because Pontiac's success was proof that creativity, not control, was what truly drove innovation. The Bonneville story wasn't just about horsepower, it was about defiance. It was a reminder that the most iconic machines often come from people willing to bend rules until they break. In 1959, Pontiac's engineers and designers weren't following orders, they were rewriting them. And the car that resulted didn't just save a brand. It changed how GM saw its future. By 1960, Pontiac had become the fastest-growing division in General Motors. Sales skyrocketed, the average buyer got younger, and suddenly, a brand once dismissed as dull was the new face of performance. Magazines called it the Great American Comeback. GM called it unexpected. But inside Pontiac, they called it justice. Years later, when enthusiasts look back, the 1959 Bonneville doesn't just stand out for its looks or its power. It stands out because it represented a moment in time when a group of engineers, artists, and dreamers refused to accept mediocrity. It was rebellion dressed in chrome. Even today, seeing one glide across the pavement feels different. You can almost hear the tension between conformity and courage, between Detroit's glass towers and the asphalt below. The Bonneville didn't just outclass GM's own divisions. It exposed how fragile the corporate machine was when faced with genuine passion. And that's why this car still matters. Because it wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't supposed to win. But it did. On every level. In the story of American cars, few have ever stood so proudly against their own creators. The 1959 Bonneville proved that innovation can't be managed by committee. It can't be planned in boardrooms. It happens when someone believes in something more than they're allowed to. Pontiac's people did. And for a brief, shining moment, they built a car so bold, it forced an empire to change. When the engine roared, it didn't just announce speed, it announced freedom, the kind Detroit hadn't heard in a long time. The 1959 Pontiac Bonneville, the car that outclassed GM itself, the car that refused to obey, and the car that made America remember. Sometimes, rebellion is the only way forward.